There is a moment that around 100 million people have watched, and yet most of them have no idea what it actually cost her to get there. A woman walks onto a television stage in Glasgow, Scotland, wearing clothes that nobody would describe as glamorous, her nerves written plainly across her face, and the audience that greets her is already deciding she is not worth their time. The judges shift in their seats with a kind of bored anticipation, ready to move on before she has even begun. And then she opens her mouth, and every assumption in that room collapses in real time. Her name is Susan Boyle. She was 47 years old when that happened, and the full story of her life is one that television has never quite managed to contain. Behind the viral clip, behind the record sales and the standing ovations, there are decades of bullying, misdiagnosis, breakdown, grief, and a voice that survived every single one of them. That is the story we are telling today. From the beginning, all the way through. Susan Boyle was born on April 1st, 1961, the youngest child of Patrick and Bridget Boyle, in a 4-bedroom council house in West Lothian, Scotland. Patrick worked as a miner and sang whenever he could, which is probably where Susan's connection to music first took root. Bridget worked as a shorthand typist and was 47 years old when Susan arrived, an age that carried real medical risk in that era, and the delivery nearly killed both of them. During the birth, Susan was briefly deprived of first oxygen, and that short window of deprivation would define how the world treated her for the next 5 decades. Doctors attributed her subsequent learning difficulties to that moment, labeling it brain damage and filing it away, and the people around her, her parents, her teachers, her classmates, all built their understanding of Susan on top of that wrong foundation. She grew up the youngest of 10 children, 4 brothers and 6 sisters, in a house full of noise and love and very little money. And from the earliest age, it was clear that she processed the world differently from those around her. What nobody understood at the time was that different did not mean lesser, but the Scotland of the 1960s and 1970s had no real framework for that distinction. School was where the damage compounded. Susan struggled to keep pace with a system built entirely around speed, and slowness in that environment was treated not as a signal to slow down, but as a character flaw to be corrected. Her teachers used a belt on her when she failed to meet academic benchmarks. Physical punishment for a child who was doing her absolute best with a brain that nobody had taken the time to understand. Her peers were worse in a different way, the cruelty being more sustained and personal. They called her Susie Simple, said it to her face and behind her back, and made the school building a place she dreaded rather than a place she could grow. She has spoken in interviews about how it felt to be left behind first, to watch lessons move on while she was still working through the same problem, to exist inside a system that interpreted her difference as failure. The only place that feeling lifted was in her parish church choir, where she sang regularly, and in local talent competitions where she actually did well. Music was where Susan Boyle made sense to herself, and she held on to it tightly through all those years when almost nothing else was working. Later, she would write and perform a song called You'll See on her first album, a direct response to every person who had laughed at her, a quiet declaration that she had made it despite everything they had done, and the fact that she put it on a record that sold 9 million copies worldwide made the point better than any argument ever could. Life after school offered little relief. She left with few qualifications, which was entirely predictable given everything she had been up against, and the job market greeted her with the same indifference the education system had shown. Applications went unanswered. Interviews went nowhere. Eventually, she landed a position as a trainee cook at West Lothian College, but that lasted only 6 months, and after that, she moved from one government training program to the next without ever finding stable ground. Money was short, and prospects felt permanently dim, which meant that when her father Patrick died and her siblings gradually built their own lives and moved out of the family home, Susan stayed. First, she became the primary caregiver for her mother Bridget, who was aging and unwell, and she poured years of her life into that role. All 10 siblings had eventually left the council house, and only Susan remained, with her cat Pebbles for company, looking after the woman who had believed in her voice, even when Susan herself had stopped fully believing. Local venues and church performances were the full extent of her musical life during those years. Bridget urged Susan repeatedly to audition for Britain's Got Talent when the show launched in 2004, but Susan resisted, convinced she was too old and that the world she saw on television simply had no place for someone like her. She also mentioned during her Britain's Got Talent appearance that she had never been married and never been kissed, and she said it with a modesty that the audience received not with pity, but with a kind of startled respect, because by that point they had already heard the voice and understood that Susan Boyle had never needed anyone's validation to know her own worth. Bridget Boyle died in 2007, and that loss changed everything. Grief does different things to different people, and for Susan, it cleared away the hesitation that had kept her from the stage. Her mother had wanted her to audition, had believed in the voice, and honoring that became something Susan could not walk away from. In 2008, having not performed publicly in any meaningful way before that point, she walked into the Britain's Got Talent audition process and eventually onto the stage in Glasgow. She was 47 years old. The song she chose was I Dreamed a Dream from the musical Les Miserables, a song about hope that has been ground down by the weight of real life, and the choice felt almost too precisely matched to her own story. Before she had finished the first chorus, the audience was standing. Amanda Holden, sitting at the judges' table, called it the biggest wake-up call she had ever experienced, pointing to how quickly everyone in that room had dismissed Susan before she sang a single note. The clip spread across the internet at a speed that early YouTube had never quite seen, reaching over 100 million views within a week, making it the most viewed video on the platform at that point in history. Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher began tweeting their support. Compilations of earlier performances, including a 1999 recording of Cry Me a River, went viral alongside the audition footage. The world had found Susan Boyle all at once and all together, and it was not prepared for what finding her felt like. None of that public adoration protected her from what the show itself was doing to her. 5 weeks of media scrutiny, relentless interview schedules, performance pressure, and the shock of sudden global attention wore her down in ways that are painful to trace in retrospect. Fame was not something Susan had ever prepared for, because she had never genuinely expected it. The night of the final, when the votes were first counted and it became clear that she had finished second behind the dance troupe Diversity, something in her gave way. Police were called to her London hotel. Hours later, she was admitted to a mental health facility, and the news of her breakdown spread almost as quickly as the audition clip had. The criticism that followed fell not on Susan, but on the show's producers, with many arguing that her fragile mental and physical health had been visible throughout the competition, and that no one with a responsibility to her well-being had intervened. The UK media regulator Ofcom considered launching an inquiry into how Britain's Got Talent had handled her situation. Though that inquiry was ultimately dropped, what the episode made undeniably clear was that behind every moment of viral triumph, there is a person with a breaking point, and Susan Boyle had reached hers in front of the entire world. Recovery came, and with it came music on a scale nobody had predicted. Her debut album, also titled I Dreamed a Dream, arrived in November 2009 and immediately rewrote what was possible for a first release. Over 2 million copies sold worldwide in the first week alone, making it the fastest-selling debut album by a female artist ever recorded at that time. By the end of its run, over 9 million copies had been sold, earning it the title of the biggest-selling record globally in the year of its release. Billboard confirmed it charted the highest first-week sales for a debut female artist's first album as recorded by SoundScan since 1991. Pre-sales on Amazon broke records before the album even shipped. 3 Guinness World Records followed, covering fastest-selling debut album by a female artist, highest first-week sales in that category, and the oldest person to reach the top of the UK album chart with a debut release. The numbers were extraordinary, but the reason people were buying was simpler than any statistic. The voice on those recordings was real, in a way that commercial music rarely manages to be, shaped by decades of private devotion to the only thing that had ever made Susan feel fully like herself. The albums kept coming after that. The Gift arrived in 2010, followed by Someone to Watch Over Me in 2011, and then Standing Ovation. The Greatest Songs from the Stage in 2012. Hope came in 2014, and A Wonderful World followed in 2016. Throughout this period, she also appeared on America's Got Talent, where audiences received her with enormous warmth, confirming that her appeal crossed every geographic and cultural boundary that might have seemed to limit it. None of the commercial success changed her daily life in the ways people expected. She bought a house in 2010 with her earnings, a natural decision for someone who had gone from financial instability to genuine wealth, but a group of individuals targeted the property relentlessly, throwing rocks, pushing fireworks through the letterbox, and attempting to break in with enough persistence that Susan eventually gave up on it entirely. She handed the house to her niece and went back to the council house in West Lothian where she had grown up, back to the church choir, back to visiting elderly congregation members in their homes, back to the routine she had always called mundane and which had always, quietly, held her together. Her wealth eventually surpassed $45 million, and she continued to live in the same home where her story had begun. What that choice says about Susan is harder to quantify than any sales figure. She had everything she needed to leave, and she stayed anyway. Because the place and the people in it were never something she wanted to escape, they were always something she wanted to return to. The diagnosis that arrived in 2013 reshuffled everything she thought she knew about herself. After more than 5 decades of being told that a brief oxygen deprivation at birth had caused permanent brain damage, Susan learned that the original diagnosis had been wrong. What she actually had was Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder, and there had never been any brain damage at all. The learning difficulties that had made school such a war zone, the differences in how she processed information and connected with people, the particular intensity of her relationship with music, all of it mapped onto Asperger's rather than onto the story she had been handed as a child. Speaking to The Guardian after the diagnosis became public, she described how the brain damaged label had always felt cruel and inaccurate, how she had always sensed that she simply thought differently rather than being fundamentally broken. She expressed the hope that going public would push people toward treating neurodivergent individuals with more patience and genuine understanding. The response from fans and the wider public was overwhelmingly supportive. That same year, a type 2 diabetes diagnosis required her to give up chocolate, which he identified as a genuine sacrifice, and the condition added another layer of daily management to a life that was already demanding more than most people could imagine navigating. It is worth sitting with the full weight of what 2013 meant for Susan. In a single year, she received an accurate diagnosis for a condition she had been misunderstood for her entire life, learned to manage a chronic illness, and continued recording and performing because stopping was never really an option she allowed herself to consider. Bridie Boyle, Susan's sister, and perhaps her closest ally through the years of sudden fame, died of cancer in 2015 at the age of 73. Bridie had been the one who kept Susan grounded when the attention of the entire world threatened to sweep her away, the one who stood beside her when the media made her appearance and her vulnerability its favorite subject, the one who held firm during the ugly family dispute that erupted after Susan gave her brother Jerry £75,000 to save his failing business. That first dispute had turned bitter when other siblings took issue with the payment, and Jerry publicly accused Susan of lying about the circumstances. Though a later crisis at Heathrow Airport would eventually bring the siblings back together, in a way that none of them had planned. Bridie's death left a gap in Susan's life that no amount of public success could fill, and after her sister passed, Susan also took on the care of Bridie's daughter, which was entirely consistent with who she had always been. Someone who showed up for the people who needed her, regardless of what it cost, in time and energy. A brief hiatus followed Bridie's death before Susan returned with her 2015 comeback, and then in 2019, she marked a decade since the audition that changed everything by releasing an album called 10, a collection of her best work that gave fans a reason to look back at how far she had traveled. The pandemic hit Susan's life with particular force. Her type 2 diabetes placed her in a high-risk category for COVID-19, meaning she had to isolate with a strictness that went beyond what most people experienced. Plans for new music stalled. The industry moved around her while she stayed carefully still. For roughly 2.5 years, recording and performing became effectively impossible. And then in April 2022, she suffered a stroke. Described as minor in medical terms, the event threatened the one thing that had defined her life from childhood through global fame and back again: her voice. She first went quiet for a period, and her fans waited. On June 4th, 2023, she walked onto a Britain's Got Talent stage and performed I Dreamed a Dream alongside the West End cast of Les Miserables, the same song that had introduced her to the world 15 years earlier. She had spent months in intensive speech therapy to make that performance possible. Afterward, she shared on Instagram that the stroke had made her wonder if she would ever stand on a stage again, and that the months of speech practice had been some of the hardest work she had ever done, harder in some ways than anything the music industry had thrown at her.
She did it anyway.
That night, singing a song about crushed dreams on a stage she had almost lost the ability to stand on, Susan Boyle made the argument for herself more powerfully than any biography ever could. Susan Boyle has spoken publicly about not having children being one of her deepest regrets, which is the kind of admission that rarely comes from celebrities and which reveals how thoroughly she has remained a private person beneath all the public attention. She is reportedly in a stable, happy relationship with an American partner whose identity she has chosen not to disclose, and she has been clear that she has no plans to marry or to bring that relationship into the public sphere. She is a practicing Roman Catholic who still sings in her church choir and still visits elderly members of her congregation in their homes. She is a non-drinker who lives in West Lothian, in the house where she grew up, the most famous person in the neighborhood, living a life she herself has described as ordinary. What Susan Boyle built across more than a decade of music, 3 Guinness records, 9 million copies of a single album, $45 million in accumulated wealth, was not built on training or industry machinery or a carefully managed image. It was built on a voice that decades of cruelty and misunderstanding had somehow failed to silence. The girl who was called Susie Simple, who was belted by teachers for being slow, who was told her brain had been damaged at birth, who cared for her mother in a council house while the world moved on without her, that girl was always going to sing. And when the world finally listened, it had no choice but to stand up.